Welcome to this evening's presentation. I'm Reed Joyce. My interest in the topic that we're covering this evening is derives from the fact that I have a daughter who lives in Clinton Township, and her two sons both went through the entire Knoch school system. They went to the elementary school, the intermediate school, the junior and senior high schools. They both played football, in fact. One graduated 4 years ago, one graduated last year. So I've followed the progress of the Knox School Board deciding to lease some of their land to drillers. And last January, I decided to take a drone that I fly over to the campus and fly around the campus. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to show you all the product of that drone flight, just to kind of set the context, to show you how close to people's residences and school systems and towns fracking infrastructure has been allowed to be created. So with that all in mind, I'm going to say, let's do this. Can you all see that? A black screen, basically.
Yep.
Okay. This is the elementary school. We're flying over the intermediate school. Everybody who lives in the Saxonburg area recognizes the football stadium, and the high school and junior high. And behind the high school and junior high, there are practice fields. There are tennis courts, practice field here, practice field here. And this is the Toma meat market. And right beside the meat market and behind that tree line is the access road to this drilling site. And the drilling site is right there. There are two open impoundments that contain fluids of various kinds, some that go down the drilling hole and some that come back up. But there's an impoundment here and there's one here. The drilling pad is square, it is concrete, and in the middle of the pad there are 6 wellheads. This particular site has been permitted to have six wells drilled from it. And each one of these 6 wellheads starts out with a long vertical component, several thousand feet, and then turns and goes off horizontally under the landscape here. In this case, most of them are parallel to each other and they go off to the southeast. The stuff in this big round pond is, I believe, overflow from material that comes back up out of the well after they drill it. And these 3 tanks in the corner are called condensate tanks. They contain material that comes back up out of the well. And the issue is that they use millions of gallons of water for each of these 6 wells. And they pump the water down into the well, and then they use the hydraulic pressure, extreme hydraulic pressure, and sometimes explosives to fracture the shale rock in which the gas is trapped. And then they got to get the water back up out of there. And so they wind up having to haul much of this material back, either temporarily holding it in impoundments or hauling it away in trucks. And we will, if you all join us next week when John Stoltz from Duquesne University is going to speak, you will hear him talk about how they bring trucks in through these access roads, and they attach a hose and they pump material from these condensate tanks into the trucks. The condensate tanks, if you drove back there this afternoon and looked at those tanks, you would see that they are placarded as containing toxic material and flammable material. But the simple act of pumping that material into one of these tanker trucks seems magic, according to John Stoltz, because once it gets into that tanker truck, it's not any longer labeled as toxic and flammable. It's called residual waste, and as if there were some other kind of waste. And then they haul it out this road and down your road and take it to some kind of landfill or a deep injection well. And the whole point of this this drone flight was just to show you how close all that activity is to this school campus. Here's the high school, middle school, elementary school, and beyond that, the town of Saxonburg. And so that's kind of the context in which we're operating everywhere in southwestern Pennsylvania, actually everywhere in southwestern and northeastern Pennsylvania, where there's intense fracking activity that liberates toxic materials that get breathed by our kids. And part of the reason for showing you this is how close this all is to this school. And Ned Ketyer, who's going to be speaking to us momentarily here, is a pediatrician, and he's well equipped. We need to mute somebody because I'm hearing all that noise.
It's Marin. Marin's the one that's making the noise.
Yeah, sorry, I'm driving, so I will mute.
Okay, that's better. But the issue is that kids are people whose physiology is still developing, and they're substantially more susceptible to the negative effects of some of the toxins that are released in all phases of shale gas development, and therefore proximity to any source of these toxins, especially to kids who are still developing physiologically, is a really bad thing. And so that's basically why we've invited Ned to speak to us. And I think if you signed up for this presentation this evening, you probably read his bio, so I'm not going to try to repeat that, other than to say that he is a Pittsburgh area physician and a pediatrician, and he is very well equipped to speak to us about the effects of fracking technology on our kids. So I'll turn this over to Ned.
Thank you, Reed. I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. I think I know many of you on this call. I'm Ned Ketyer. I'm a pediatrician, like Reed said, in Pittsburgh. I'm retired now, and I spend most of my time educating people, learning about fracking, the problem of plastic pollution that fracking creates, and of course the climate crisis. There are a lot of myths the oil and gas industry tells Pennsylvanians about fracking that just aren't true. One of the biggest ones that the industry is highly regulated by competent and uncorrupted state regulatory agencies. And another myth is that fracking can be done safely. As the recent grand jury report makes abundantly clear, both of these myths are false. So tonight I'm going to show you how fracking harms health, especially the health of our children. In part 2 of this series, Professor John Stoltz will dive into the rapidly growing problem of fracking waste and radiation in that waste. That'll be really interesting, and the impact it has on our water sources. And then in part 3, my colleagues at Environmental Health Project, Sarah Rankin and Nathan Daron, will handle the details about the deteriorating air quality and what community members must do to protect themselves from this dirty and dangerous heavy industry. Next slide, please. I'll let Di handle that. Yeah, next slide after that, please. Great. When Michael invited me to come and speak to all of you tonight, about what Butler County residents are dealing with regarding fracking operations there. It was an invitation for me to impart some of my knowledge to all of you, but it was also an invitation to spend literally hours using my Google Earth machine to play a version of Where's Waldo. And in my case, it's find all the well pads and the rest of the cluster frac. It's fun and you should try that. Pick a place in southwestern Pennsylvania and then start slowly zooming out. And you'll be amazed at what you can find and what you can see from outer space. Next slide, please. We're going to start talking about setback distances here. In Pennsylvania, the legal setback distance from a fracked gas well is 500 feet. Environmental Health Project conducted a Delphi study in 2018, and the expert consensus was that setback distances should be greater than 1/4 mile, which is 1,320 feet, from any area where human activity takes place. And they also said that additional setbacks should be used for settings where vulnerable groups are found, including schools, daycare centers, and hospitals. In 2014, the Maryland Department of Health decided that a minimal setback distance of 2,000 feet was appropriate. Subsequently, Maryland banned fracking from the state. Pennsylvania grand jury earlier this year investigating fracking recommended that statewide setback distances should be pushed back even further because, quote, the current minimum 500 feet just isn't high enough. They recommended that the no drill zone or the setback distance should be at least 2,500 feet, not 500 feet. And they said that even the distance is still only a short stroll within sight and sound of residences. And they said, we do not believe such a modest buffer zone is too much to ask when it comes to people's health and homes. So the grand jury called for a doubling of the setback for schools and hospitals. And they said, we think the no drill zone for schools and hospitals should be even bigger, 5,000 feet. We understand that fracking has its benefits, they said. We just want to give it some separation from the places we eat and sleep, treat the sick, and educate our children. And in 2018, Environmental Health Project made the following recommendations on minimum setback distance. Small shale gas facilities and wells, 1 kilometer, that's about 3,200 feet. Gas processing facilities and large compressor stations, 2 kilometers, which is about 6,600 feet. And the distance from schools, daycares, hospitals, nursing homes, and other high occupancy buildings that house vulnerable populations and are difficult to evacuate, 2 kilometers or 6,600 feet. So why are setbacks so important? If you could go to the next slide. It's because we know that people who live and work and children who learn and play near fracked gas sites are vulnerable to environmental degradation and pollution from fracking. And we know now from abundant research in Pennsylvania and other states, and from the grand jury report released again earlier this summer, that people are being impacted and their health is being damaged. It shouldn't surprise anyone that women and children would be at the top of the list of impacted residents. Pregnancies can be complicated by prematurity, low birth weight, and small for gestational age babies and birth defects, all of which have lifelong consequences. The health risk to infants and children living near shale gas development is especially concerning. Children aren't little adults, and their behaviors and interactions with the environment increase the risk of exposure to toxic chemicals. They spend more time outdoors than adults, playing in the grass and the dirt where the pollution settles. And every parent knows that kids shove everything in their mouths, right? Dirty hands and fingers and toys and food. And we all now know how hard it is to get kids to wash their hands before they put that food in their mouth. Children's bodies grow and develop rapidly, making their organs and body systems more susceptible to damage from toxic exposures. Some of these chemicals discharged during fracking operations are known as endocrine disrupting chemicals. These have been shown to interfere with children's growth and development and linked to major problems with cognitive and brain development. And children have a long shelf life, which means that they have years and even decades to manifest symptoms and signs of disease like chronic diseases and cancer. We should all remember that poor health in childhood increases the likelihood of poor health in adulthood. Older people and those with limited financial resources are also at risk, as are people of color, who often live in environmental justice zones close to polluting industries like the oil and gas and petrochemical industry. Residents who have existing medical conditions like chronic lung disease, heart disease, kidney disease, mental illness, and children with asthma are at higher risk of having exacerbations to those diseases. Fracking jobs are dangerous jobs, and the industry workers are at high risk of acute injuries, exposures, and illnesses. And lastly, we shouldn't forget our first responders. In the United States, the shale gas industry is not legally required to disclose the identity of the chemicals that are used in fracking operations. And this secrecy puts first responders at a disadvantage when called upon to respond to an emergency, and it puts their health and safety in danger. Next slide, please. Harmful pollution is generated at every point of frac gas infrastructure, from the teeming diesel truck traffic servicing super well pads, and those super well pads can hold dozens of gas wells being drilled and fracked, and the toxic and radioactive waste that is generated at the wellhead and is disposed of in landfills and injection wells where even more pollution occurs. Pipelines scar the landscape and occasionally leak, and they spill and explode sometimes. Compressor stations emit copious volumes of air pollutants, fine particulate matter, ozone-forming nitrogen oxides, cancer-causing VOCs, radon gas, and more. And pollution continues at the gas processing facilities before the refined hydrocarbons are sent to local cracker plants, but also a large amount of it goes to distant countries with an insatiable desire and appetite for single-use plastic. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I think most of you understand what goes down the well. Certainly millions of gallons of fresh water, as Reed was talking about, sand and chemicals, many of which we don't know what they are. Next slide. And what comes back up is really important because most of it is toxic. The solid drill cuttings, the rock and dirt, and the salty corrosive brine are contaminated with fracking chemicals, heavy metals, and other earth elements from the highly radioactive Marcellus Shale. And by the way, we've known for decades that the Marcellus Shale is highly radioactive. Non-fuel gases like volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and hydrogen sulfide, these are the fumes of fossil fuels, return to the surface and they contaminate the air that we breathe. What comes back up in the form of solid waste gets trucked to commercial and municipal landfills where it's buried. And I'm going to leave the rest of this story for part 2 with Professor Stoltz, because he's going to talk to you about the toxic leachate and how that gets into landfills and water treatment plants and so forth, and what is contained in that leachate. But finally, on this slide, methane and liquid hydrocarbons are what we're fracking for, after all. And methane leaks like crazy from fracked gas sites. As you all know, methane is many times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. Despite all the leaking and the flaring and the venting of methane, there is a myth that's told by industry that fracking is good and actually helps solve the climate crisis. But this isn't true. In fact, fracking accelerates climate change. Next slide, please. Emissions aren't just coming from the well pads. By the way, this is a well pad in Washington County that I have visited many times on Lois Bjornson's frackland tours. The last time I went, they were fracking, and the diesel engines and the fumes from those diesel engines were overwhelming from all the trucks and the engines on the well pads. And it seems like every tour I do, I come away with some of the common symptoms that people have been complaining about for years. And I'll go over some of those symptoms later, but we know from the grand jury that those complaints fell on deaf ears at the DEP and the Department of Health for many, many years. Next slide. Fracked gas travels through rural communities and suburban backyards via an extensive network of pipelines, pig launchers, and compressor stations. And stopping first at cryogenic shale gas refineries before moving on to plastics and chemical factories and export terminals and to other countries. Next slide. Pig launchers are stations where pipelines are periodically cleaned out of gunk and scale and vented into the atmosphere. The gunk and scale is, by the way, radioactive and contaminated with chemicals and gases that I just mentioned. This slide, by the way, was loaned to me by my good friend, Bob Donnan. I think many of you know Bob. In fact, the next few slides are from a talk he gave here in Butler County in 2015. I was getting this talk together yesterday and I sent him an email saying, Bob, you have any slides from Butler? And he said, oh yeah, and he sent me a bunch. Compressor stations emit enormous volumes of air contaminants, methane, VOCs, and nitrogen oxides, which help form ground level ozone, which is an air pollutant that affects everyone's lung function. Pennsylvania has hundreds of compressor stations like this one. And this one, a report from Environmental Health Project in 2017 of compressor stations in New York State found that every compressor station routinely releases large volumes of chemicals associated with a variety of diseases and disorders. Next slide, please. Yes, if you can go to the next slide. And then the next slide. Very good, thank you. And that's another one in Butler. And one more slide, next slide, please. The gas winds up at a processing facility, which is really a refinery, that further distills the gas into different components before heading out to market. Now, this is a small processing plant. If you go to the next slide, there's another smaller refinery. But then the next slide, if you could go to that, that's the big kahuna, the Bluestone Cryogenic gas facility that's over by the Seneca Valley School campus. And it's pretty enormous. Next slide, please. And of course, the destination for a lot of the methane and the ethane being fracked out of the ground is this massive ethane cracker plant being built by Royal Dutch Shell 24 miles upwind and downriver from Pittsburgh and just a few miles more from the Knoch area school district. Next slide, please. This Beaver County cracker plant is one of the largest ever built anywhere, and it will transform fracked ethane molecules into ethylene. Once the plant is completed and operational in the next couple of years, it will produce millions of tons of plastic nurdles. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you what those nurdles look like. They're little tiny plastic pellets. Nearly 2 trillion of these nurdles will be produced every year from this one cracker plant. At least 2 or 3 other cracker plants are expected to be built in the Ohio River Valley over the next decade or so. And this will require at least 1,000 new fracked gas wells drilled every year to feed them. You can go to the next slide, because I want to come back home to Butler County and the situation around Knoch High School that you can see there. I saw this, Michael sent me this slide, and it looks innocuous enough. You see the well pad on the left lower part and Knoch High School campus and the other schools, the intermediate and the elementary school. And you see the residences at the top, and on the far right, the beginning of really where Saxonburg starts. And I thought, okay, if you can go to the next slide, I started measuring out from the middle of that well pad. It's 1,600 feet to the meat market, a little bit more to the edge of the practice field, and 2,400 feet to the to the middle of that high school building. So a little bit less to the entrance. And you can see it's about a half a mile to that residence there. I think that's a mobile home area, I'm not sure. And then from that impoundment that Reed was talking about, it's only about 340 feet to the meat market, 500 feet to the edge of the practice field, and 1,230 feet to the high school. And you can see how close it is also to those residences. And if you can go to the next slide, I started zooming out because I like playing this game of finding a spot and then zooming out and seeing what I see. And as you can see in the upper right area on the other side of Saxonburg is a pretty big well pad. I just keep zooming out on the next slide. And now you can see all sorts of visible infrastructure if you can go to the next slide. Let me just see that we're on the right slides. If you go to one more slide, that would be great. Perfect. And so you can start seeing well pads that are around. And if you go to the next slide, all of these sites, but also are well pads, but there are also a few compressor stations as well. We can see just how close they are to the school and to Saxonburg even. And I want to stop here and just talk to you briefly about aggregate emissions, because all of a sudden it's not just one well pad here and there that's contaminating the air. It's many well pads, as you can see, and all the diesel trucks needed to service them. And it's pipelines and pigging stations and compressors and processing facilities and one big cracker plant upwind about 30 miles away. These create cumulative emissions, and this is why I call this whole thing a petrochemical cluster frac. If you could go to the next slide, and we zoom out just a bit more, and now you can see a compressor station to the northwest of the school campus, around 2 miles away. That's the Jefferson compressor station that I showed you earlier. Next slide, please. So we zoom out even more. And wow, look at where the campus is and look at all those blue balloons. Those are well pads and compressor stations. Some of the well pads, if you take a close look at them, hold a handful of wells, but some of them are enormous and are built to hold dozens of wells, at least more than a dozen. And there you're able to see where the pipelines are in some places, compressor stations. You can see the pig launchers if you look closely. I spent a good afternoon trying to find all this infrastructure from space, and I'm sure I missed some of it. Michael asked me in the next slide to look at the Seneca Valley High School, and it's a little bit hard to see. I used a different color balloon. They're teal colored. And I probably missed a lot of sites because I didn't spend quite as much time on this, but you can see a lot of well pads and compressor stations in the Bluestone cryogenic gas processing facility, all in close proximity to the school campus. And by the way, if you just look to the bottom left, you can see that cracker plant. So that's where the cracker plant is. We'll zoom out in the next slide, and you can see what fracking looks like in Pennsylvania. There are now more than 12,500 active shale gas wells in the state, which you see as purple dots on this updated frac tracker map. Most of the activity is in the northeastern and southwestern parts of the state, and almost all of it has happened in the last 10 or 12 years. The green dots show where several hundred compressor stations are, and they move the gas along the pipelines. And the yellow dots indicate where violations have occurred so far. There are more violations than wells, and some of these have actually been, they're criminal violations. About 1.5 million Pennsylvania residents live within a half a mile of a shale gas infrastructure, and many are much closer. More than 300,000 children attend daycare or school within a half a mile. Next slide, please. So all this stuff is happening where people live and where children play. That's a pretty big well pad being drilled. Those are not small houses around that well pad, but you can see just how big that well pad is. The next slide, you can see how close it is to schools. This is the Fort Cherry School District campus, which is actually kindergarten through high school, surrounded now by 5 fracked gas well pads. The closest well on the left is 900 feet from the school's driveway in rural Washington County. It's the only entrance and exit into and out of the school's campus. So if that school campus has to be evacuated for any reason, it's going to be a nightmare. There are also, aside from well pads, there are also compressor stations and shale gas refineries, all operating around where these children go to school. The next picture is happening around where children play. I don't think there's any parent, certainly no pediatrician, that would look at this photograph and find it acceptable in any way. Most of the emissions, though, coming from fracked gas and petrochemical infrastructure are invisible. And in the next slide, I would like to show you a video. If you could just click advance one more time. My colleague, Leanne Leiter from Earthworks, loaned me this video to show you how looks can be deceiving. This is a compressor station in rural Washington County. Here in the middle of the afternoon, once we get to it, the video does not work well.
Just copy the one or the other of them and paste it. And
Okay, so
what number and code?
I'll tell you what. Let's just skip. Just take my word for it. You can go to Earthworks website, and you can download their video. Just go to the next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Okay.
Okay, wait, I couldn't get it to advance. I'll try again.
It's okay. We can just skip this slide. It's okay. It's a video, and sometimes that doesn't work well.
Yeah, it's not working very well. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Just let's go to the next slide. That's fine.
Okay.
Some of you, you know what? I bet you maybe Sarah and Nathan will show some of these videos in part 3, since they're going to be talking about air quality. I'll ask them if they would be able to show those.
Okay. Is this what you're looking for?
I don't see anything yet.
You can't
If
see
you
it,
go,
Don.
it's probably slide 34.
It's dark.
Yep, that's the one. That's absolutely the one. Yes.
Okay.
So if you could click slideshow, yeah, that's perfect right there. Up. Now click advance. All right. Anyway, you can, well, let's just keep this going. You can see, you don't see any emissions from this compressor station. This is a compressor station. It looks beautiful, doesn't it? But this is what you see with the FLIR camera, which is an infrared camera. This is the middle of the afternoon. And you can see what looks like smoke. But I showed you the picture with the regular camera. There was no smoke. And again, this video is not going to work well. So let's just click advance and we'll go to the next slide.
I will have to do that manually. There's,
That's fine. That's fine. Just click on slide number 35 and we'll start there.
Can you see that?
Not yet, but I think there's a little delay, probably. I don't see it yet.
Hold on, please. I think I'm having a hard time sharing my screen again.
All right.
Okay.
Well, you know, I'm just gonna keep talking because I have my slides open in front of me.
Okay.
And while you pull that up, it's slide 35. It's the picture of the PSR compendium, and the risks and harms of fracking are well known. and well documented in the 6th edition of the Fracking Science Compendium, which was published in 2019, last year, by Physicians for Social Responsibility and Concerned Health Professionals of New York, which was a state that successfully banned fracking. The report is readily available, easily available online, with more than 1,700 peer-reviewed studies and investigative reports that found no evidence that fracking can operate without threatening public health directly or without imperiling climate stability upon which public health depends. Are you having trouble finding that? Anyway, the point that I want to make is that there's a myth that's often told by the oil and gas industry that health harms from fracking have not been documented. That's not true. It's all right here in the compendium, and a new 7th edition will be out before the end of the year. And I think we're having trouble with the slides. I'm going to let Di work on that. I'm just going to keep going.
I'm sorry, I didn't know you wanted me to advance it. Where am I, where you're at, where you want me to be?
Well, start on slide 35. If you bring it up, you'll see all the slides on the left, and you can click
Is that,
on slide.
this is slide 35, Ned.
It's the PSR slide. It's the one after the video that failed to play.
Yeah, that's it.
So you have to share that. There we go.
I'm sorry.
Great, great. Now, if you could just play from that current slide. Beautiful, beautiful. So that's the Fracking Science Compendium. And again, I would encourage everybody to go to PSR's website and download that. If you go to the next slide. EHP did a study back in 2017 looking at symptoms that people were complaining about, something that the health department was failing to do. It was looking at the symptoms of adult residents living 1 kilometer from the well pad. You had sleep disruption, usually due to the nonstop truck activity, the noise, the odors, the light, headaches and throat irritation, stress and anxiety are side effects of living near fracking sites. Some of these symptoms look like nuisance symptoms. Some of them get more serious, the shortness of breath, certainly fatigue, nausea, wheezing. But when you're exposed to this type of activity day in, day out, week in, month out, and for the super well pads, we're talking year in and year out, these acute symptoms of exposure and stress can become chronic medical problems. There's a saying that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't think there's any doctor that believes that. And I can tell you that as you get older, that's really not true. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you a lot weaker. Next slide. So we saw earlier that low birth weights, prematurity, and birth defects are all outcomes associated with pregnant women living in proximity to shale gas sites. The next slide basically says the evidence is in. Living near fracking sites has been linked to asthma, rashes, headaches, and unfortunately cancer. And if we can go to the next slide, we already know that children and adults living near frack gas operations are sickened by industrial pollution and by more than 170 chemicals used in the fracking process. No fewer than 55 of those chemicals are known to raise the risk of cancer in children and adults. And radioactive fracking waste is another major problem that also increases cancer risk. From 2008 to 2018, in 4 heavily fracked counties in southwestern Pennsylvania, Dave Templeton and Don Hopi at the Post-Gazette uncovered 27 cases of Ewing sarcoma, a very rare and frequently fatal bone cancer of childhood, and 40 cases of other rare cancers, for a total of 67 rare cancers in children, teenagers, and young adults. The 4 counties were Westmoreland, Washington, Greene, and Fayette counties, and again, from 2008 to 2018. In Washington County, where I live and work, 6 cases of rare cancer, rare Ewing sarcoma, and 30 other rare childhood cancers were counted, just in that one rural county. These numbers are far more than would be expected to occur in a similarly populated area over this 10-year period. And new cases keep popping up in the region. Parents and physicians are very concerned that pollution and toxic waste from fracking operations may be to blame for this outbreak of very rare childhood cancers. Next slide. Last November, I had the chance to be at the State House with dozens of concerned community members. We spoke with Governor Wolf and other lawmakers and demanded a thorough and transparent investigation into the cause of these rare pediatric cancers. The next slide. 4 days later, Governor Wolf announced the creation of 2 studies to be conducted over a 3-year period by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. But here we are now, 10 months later, in the middle of a pandemic, and we're still waiting to learn about study designs and timelines. Next slide. In June, the Pennsylvania grand jury released a scathing report about the harms to health, property, and livelihoods of Pennsylvanians living and working near fracked gas operations. The grand jury has already proven criminality within the industry, and this report demonstrates complicity of the 2 government agencies in charge of regulating it, the DEP and the Department of Health. Time and again in its report, the grand jury kept returning to the fact that it was children living in the gas patch whose health was suffering the most. The grand jury didn't lose sight of the big picture, saying, quote, "We first allowed the timber in our Commonwealth to be plundered, then it was our coal, now it's shale. This is the time to learn our lesson for the future. Who will bear the inevitable risks? We say it should be those who exploit the resources, not those who live among them." And you can see the recommendations that they came up with for state regulators to try to fix the problems that they so clearly documented. But reading between the lines, it's clear that the risks from fracking are inevitable because fracking is inherently dirty and dangerous, and industry rules and government regulations can't fix that fact. The evidence is in, and it's indisputable. Fracked gas makes people sick, degrades the environment and the ecosystems necessary to sustain all life, and accelerates global warming and climate change. Next slide. I'm going to stop here, and I'm just going to say that that children live in a world shaped by our choices. We need to start making better choices for the sake of our children and for the sake of our grandchildren. And we better make them fast because we've run out of time. The next slide just has more information if you want to keep that up, or we're done with the slideshow. I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
If you want to ask questions, you can add them to the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand. Or I guess I can't see any of you.
I have a question.
Go for it. There's not a lot of chat activity.
Well, here's the question. What do you do with this information? You know, I mean, I just basically went through the health impacts. This is ridiculous. This is a crazy industry that so directly harms the health and threatens the health of residents that live near it. So you have all this infrastructure. What do you do with it, with the information that you have? You know, these well pads, a lot of them have been around for several years. They're already producing. The fracking is done. this industry can come back and frack again. In fact, each well can be fracked up to 10 times. And then, once they're done fracking the Marcellus, they can come back to these well pads and drill deeper into the Utica Shale and continue the process of drilling and fracking. So, when Range Resources says that drilling is just the beginning, they weren't kidding. But right now, these well pads are producing. They're leaking. We know that they're leaking. The one thing we could do is we could step up inspections of these well pads, of these compressor stations, and try to identify the leaks and try to stop the leaks. It's not just methane that's leaking, it's volatile organic compounds and other chemicals that are affecting our air quality and creating a chemical environment that's really dangerous for us, and especially dangerous for the students at the Knoch High School and the other schools there. So, what do you do? You gotta, I think you have to, if you can't make it safe, and I'm telling you, I don't think you can, then at least you have to stop doing what you're doing and address what the grand jury said to address. And until you can address that, until you can increase setback distances, until you can increase the accountability and the power of the DEP to do the right thing and the Department of Health to do the right thing, and get people in there to do the inspections, I don't see how you can continue this activity. I think there should be we should pump the brakes on it until we figure out whether it can be done safely. Having said that, I'm pretty convinced that it can't be done safely. There are so many inherent risks. There are geologic risks. There are risks related to chemistry, biochemistry, physics. We need to move. Along on this conversation to the type of energy sources and materials that we need. We need to transform our transportation systems, our agricultural systems. We need to move beyond. I think I would caution people who say, oh, we should ban it, we should fight for a ban. We need to move beyond that conversation to the type of world that we want to see. If you read a lot of the plans out there, they're really, the good plans out there, there really is no room for fracking, for new fracking and continuation of this. Now, these well pads, these compressor station sites, these processing facilities, these are going to end up being Superfund sites. And someday our children and our grandchildren are going to have to clean it up. And they're not going to be able to return it to productive farmland, which they once were. And they're not going to be able to turn them into neighborhoods for people to live and kids to play in, because it's just going to be too toxic.
So the question was asked, is the objective to stop fracking?
Yeah, it depends. To answer that question, it depends on the hat that I wear. If I'm wearing my environmental health project, I'm not talking about banning fracking. I'm talking about helping people understand what they're being exposed to and try to protect themselves. And then to push the industry and to push our legislators to do the right thing and make things safe. And yeah, if you can't make things safe, then I'm going to put on my PSR hat and say you should stop it. But if I'm going to wear my climate reality hat, if I'm going to wear my pediatrician hat, if I'm going to wear my human being who's also a father hat, I'm going to say, we need to move on. We need to, find solutions to the climate crisis, because ultimately, fracking is not compatible with solving the climate crisis.
Anyone else?
Just an observation. MOB's goals since MOB's inception has been to ban fracking completely. Our position is basically it cannot. It has been demonstrated everywhere. It's been done around the planet that it cannot be done safely, regardless of how slick the ads are that we see on television that tout its safety. It's not our objective to in any way attack people who have leased their land for fracking, especially around here, because most of those leases were signed back before the science supported the present acknowledgement of the dangers of fracking and the inability of the industry to do it safely. We often come across as being kind of snarky, and Diane Sipe made an observation this afternoon. Says one of the questions for tonight submitted by Robert Burns is something that we need to address at the outset. What is the purpose of these webinars, this one and the next couple? Is it to move the oil fields, move the site, the one that we're addressing this evening, the one in Saxonburg? The notion is that basically we need to be vigilant for the health impacts, and this is Ned's whole story. Be vigilant for the health impacts, and that communities must be proactively responsible to protect themselves, because clearly if left to industry and its enablers, it won't happen. I guess the point is that there just doesn't really seem to be any solution that will move directly toward improved community health than stopping fracking completely. And that includes the things in the Ohio Valley that lead to the cracker plant, it being a great big draw for a lot of fracking sites in the areas and a lot of the pipelines. And every element of shale gas development, as Ned pointed out, is fraught with more than enough opportunity to provide leaks of a material that is more potent as a greenhouse gas than anything else we have access to. So there.
Right, and I would just add that the purpose of these webinars is to provide information, and what I'm providing and what the other folks are going to provide in the next two parts is evidence-based knowledge and information. What residents do with that information that's the next step. But you have to get the information first. It has to come from a trusted source first, and it has to be evidence-based. What I find when I travel is, there are a lot of people that are just not aware. There are people that live close to this that are not aware. I bet you there are a lot of teachers that work in that Knoch area school district that don't have a clue where that well pad is. They don't understand. They don't know. They're not told. They don't know. And they're at risk. And some of those teachers may be pregnant. And some of the parents that come by the school to pick up their kids, they may be pregnant. And they may not be aware. Or maybe they don't want to be aware, but nevertheless, they're not aware. And so, I think that you have to certainly bring the knowledge to people. People have to understand and think about it and even research it, ask hard questions. You're not going to be moving well pads, and it's not fair to ask people to move. I've heard doctors say, well, why don't you just move away? Now, that's not fair. Why should you have to move away? These industries don't belong anyway. And yes, what we know now, we didn't know, 6 or 7 or 8 years when the fracking really took off. And I think the landowners were told a lot of lies. They were really lied to. There's a lot of that's going on in this country and has been going on for some time. But that's what we have. So we rather than looking back, we need to look forward. We have a climate crisis. We have a global plastic ecological catastrophe on our hands. We have air pollution and pollution of our waterways, our drinking water, that's affecting our farmlands. We have to fix this. We have to fix this, and we fix it by looking forward, by not blaming, as Reed said, but looking forward and finding common ground. And I can't find ground that's more common than clean air and pure water and a healthy climate system.
This is Diane. If I could make a remark, I think that's the question raised is, what do we do about the wells that are there? Well, unlike the residents of Pennsylvania, they knew what they were doing. And so to waste a lot of sympathy because, they've put in something dangerous to communities that we want them to stop, I'm just not there. I cannot have sympathy for the devil.
Yeah, but I think the people that allowed it are not the devil.
I'm not I'm talking about the industry.
Well, the industry, yes, the industry knew. The industry, this was a relatively new, fracking was relatively new engineering process. I bet you didn't know that the first fracked well pad was actually fracked with a nuclear weapon in Colorado. I want to say in the 1940s. Look it up; it's interesting. But they knew. They've known for many, many decades, since early in the last century, that the Marcellus Shale was highly radioactive. That's not a surprise to people who understand the geology of this region. Yeah, they knew, and they lied, and people bought it, and they were, some people were given a lot of money, some people were given some money, and they were told it would be clean and safe, and that was a lie.
Another thing that is sort of big picture stuff that's new, and you may not have enough information to comment meaningfully on it, but there is, in fact, this global COVID-19 pandemic, and some assertions that I've heard that various kinds of comorbidity that is produced by exposure to fracking is something that reduces your resistance to or increases the seriousness of exposure to COVID-19 virus.
Right, and we do know that air pollution affects the immune system. It affects the body's protection against respiratory viruses, and we now know that air pollution results in poorer outcomes and worse outcomes with COVID-19. So for people who breathe dirty air, and PM 2.5, it doesn't matter the source of the PM 2.5. Fine particulate matter is fine particulate matter, and any machine that produces it is going to affect you, and that includes the fracking industry. We know that outcomes for COVID-19 are worse when people breathe polluted air.
So Barbara had a comment, where I live, there are wells within blocks in every direction, and anything plastic can do, hemp can do too. That really interests me. What is the holdout on using hemp for a myriad of incredible technologies? I don't understand the pushback outside of, hemp is not marijuana. So. Yeah,
that's a good question. I think it's moneyed interest. I think the petrochemical, oil and gas industry is so powerful. They've corrupted so many state, local, and even federal government that that's they say follow the money, follow the money. Yes, growing hemp would help take some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It would produce materials for the next generation of things that we need moving forward. So, it is one very important solution, and one that can be adopted very quickly. There's that. But I'd say follow the money.
Always follow the money. We have another question. Karen, attempts to make fracking safer are always cynically used by our government to tell people that they're on it and fracking can continue. Does that concern you when you have your EHP hat on?
That's a good question. Thank you, Karen, for asking me and putting me on the spot. Does it? Well, I'll tell you that it's a discussion that we've had at EHP and other organizations that we work with, other partner organizations have talked about. EHP's role is to present the science. That's our lane, to gather the science, to generate the data, to explain it to the public, and to help people make decisions that will help protect them. That is the mission of EHP. That's what provides, we say follow the money, that's what provides our grant money, is being able to stay in that lane. The good news for me, though, is that I can wear a number of hats. So no, it doesn't make me uncomfortable when I wear my EHP hat, because I'm following a different lane. I'm focused on gathering data, peer-reviewed evidence, and trying to translate that evidence for others. If people ask me, should we ban it? I can remove that hat and put on my PSR hat and be very comfortable saying absolutely. And I try to wear as many hats as possible when I give talks like this, so that people don't get the wrong impression. Because I'm going to take all my hats off now and just say, again, as I said before, that fracking has never been done safely anywhere. It's inherently dangerous and dirty, and cannot be regulated safely. It just can't. And I think that we can talk about fracking bans. You legislate a fracking ban, it's going to be in court for years, and we're going to lose time. We need to move beyond. If you look at a lot of the climate plans, the Green New Deal plans, even the Biden plan, there is no room for fracking. If you read it carefully, and I would encourage you to read it carefully, the plan on climate change, there's no room for fracking. I think that he's just not going to waste political capital in this state calling for something that at least shouldn't happen anyway. Anyway, it's up to us when he gets inaugurated to push him really hard. We need to move away fast from fracking.
One of the things we're going to hear from EHP in a couple of weeks is that the data that their whole pitch is based on comes from us. It has to come from us. We have to provide the information about community health and proximity to fracking or other shale gas extraction activities. So their whole registry, for example, is something that we need to encourage everybody to participate in.
Have you tried to go on the DOH registry, oil and gas registry? Have you tried to find it? It's very, very difficult to find. I went on it a week or two ago, and it took me about 15 minutes. I'm pretty good with computers. And then once you get on it, it gives you like 4 or 5 bullet points that they tell you that you should satisfy before you submit your complaint. Like, get your water and your soil tested. Talk to your doctor and, get blood tests. I mean, just ridiculous. People look at that and they probably are like, I just wanted to complain about an odor or a spill or, the air emissions that I'm seeing and smelling and that are making me sick. They know that the Department of Health doesn't respond anyway. You're left with nothing.
Any other questions?
Are we finished?
We may be.
I'd like to ask our participants a question. How did they hear about this webinar? And we had sent out a mailing, and we're in an interest of trying to determine what's effective. In the chat, could you maybe indicate if you heard of this webinar by the postcard? You could just put me or yes or something like that.
Okay.
Oh, great. Thank you, Adam.
Okay. That's one.
We got 3 there. Okay. Robert
There's
Burns.
another
Robert?
question. Should we keep children out of school and homeschool to keep them away from the area?
Should we, are we talking about fracking or are we talking about COVID?
I'm assuming we're talking about the Knox School District and the fracking. I'm going to assume.
Yeah, okay.
Donna.
That's a good question. I don't know what to say. I think if you're thinking of homeschooling, it depends on where you live. And I'd go on Google Earth and find your house and then start to zoom out and make some measurements and see how far away you actually are. You know, you might be really close. It might be farther away. You know, but the thing is that you're also going from school to a field to play a game, or you're going shopping in Saxonburg, which, as you saw on the map, is surrounded by all this activity. I mean, the cumulative air emissions are potentially enormous. The air shed is probably not very healthy to breathe for anybody in the area. So your home may not be safer than the school. I think the key is if you're a parent and you have a child at the school district, it might be a good idea to start talking to people in the school. You know, what is your air exchange like in the school? What is your ventilation system like? You know, get an idea of that. Are you aware that air quality is a problem and that, you know, kids need to be protected? I would have parents make sure that you're looking at air quality forecasts on airnow.gov. And on days when air quality is poor, especially your ozone action days, you should be inside. You shouldn't have recess. You shouldn't be playing your sports. You shouldn't be out on the playground playing. And I'd be very careful if you have a medical condition to go out when it's a yellow alert, which is moderate air quality. That's not good air quality. And if you have asthma, if your child has other problems, they probably shouldn't be out playing either. But I think the key is for parents to be aware. And if parents are listening to this and they're saying, what do I do now? You know, I don't know what to do. Well, then I guess I did my job, because I don't really know what to do either. Talk to your pediatrician, let them know what you're worried about. They may give you ideas of what you can do in your home to keep your air clean and keep the outdoor air pollution from coming indoors. There are things that people can do to make the air in your house healthier. And it's just, you know, this is what we have in this area. And it's really just, it's a bad thing. This is why this is a crisis. There are no easy answers.
For those of us who live in southwestern Pennsylvania, the fact is that these sites are not going to go away. So our choices right now would seem to be to just study the issues and try to figure out how best ourselves and what the environment is that we presently find ourselves in, and at the same time argue in all of the forums that we can get for a ban on fracking.
Marin had a question. Do you feel that the precarious financial situation of the fracking and petrochemical industry will hasten the transition away from shale gas and ethane cracking? The industry is leveraged to the hilt, and there's a global glut on plastics.
And then after Marin, Leslie, put Robert on staff, please.
So the answer for Marin is, I've heard the same thing. I've read the same thing. I'm not holding my breath because I guess that's the pessimist in me. But again, I think that is, you know, that we need to move on from fracking. We need to get away from fracking, get away from all fossil fuels, get away from petrochemicals and the health disaster that caused, the ecological disaster. And we need to do something about climate change. And the only way to do that is to decrease emissions by decreasing the amount and then stopping fossil fuel extraction as soon as possible. So if the industry goes belly up, it can't happen soon enough. But there's a lot of money involved, and there's a lot of corruption involved. There are a lot of factors that have to happen. A lot of things have to fall into place before things go belly up for the industry, I'm afraid.
And Robert had a question. My apologies, Robert. Do you see any science solution to containing the contamination due to fracking?
Do I see any science solution?
Yes.
You know, I'm not an engineer, but I know that these companies have very smart engineers. I know that they have physicists. I know that they have, you know, geologists. I know that they've had years and even decades to figure this out. And they still, in 2020, have not figured out a way to keep the emissions from escaping into the atmosphere. You know, it's like any internal combustion engine. In order to use fossil fuels, you need to use the atmosphere as a sewer. You can't use an internal combustion engine, a diesel engine, for example, without exhausting the byproducts into the atmosphere. That's what I mean by it's inherently dangerous. There are inherent problems to this whole cluster frac that you can't regulate, you can't control, you can't scientifically stop it. We understand chemical equations, and we understand the principles of thermodynamics. And if you burn a certain volume of shale gas, you're going to have a certain volume of byproducts. Many of them are toxic, and you can't change that equation. You can't change that fact. It is what it is.
I think that's the end of the questions. Anybody else before we close out?
Let's hope we see everybody next week for John Stoltz's presentation.
Yes, bring
It'll
a friend.
be a good one. It'll be a good one. He's a great speaker. And Sarah and Nathan at EHP are also very good. I encourage everybody to listen. I think you'll all enjoy it and learn a lot. And I want to thank you guys for allowing me to come and speak. I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ned.
Thank you, Ned.
All right.
Good night.
Okay,
Good night,
thank you.
everybody.